Hello, this is Edith Newmeyer, and I am the author of the book, The Mystery of Adam. I want to continue today on reviewing some of my research for my next book called The Mystery of the Second Adam. And I've been looking at Isaiah, and I have been looking at Zechariah, and just researching some prophecies that these two prophets um, wrote about Messiah. And so now I want to look at more historically. So I'm going to start in Genesis and kind of look at examples of ways where Messiah was talked about in a covered up or in a hidden way. I said before that Messiah was kind of hidden in the Old Testament. Only really the men of God were aware of Messiah coming. And but the popular people, they're just regular people. I guess they knew it too, but it wasn't such a big thing. I know there's many people that waited for Messiah during Jesus's time. The two people that were in the temple, um, and what were they called? There's a man and a woman who were waiting for Messiah, and they recognized him when he was brought in the temple. So people were waiting. Mary knew about Messiah, and that's why she could say, "Yeah, I will accept getting pregnant by the Holy Spirit." Not Moses. Joseph knew about Messiah, of course, and yeah, so did Elizabeth, and I think his name was Zechariah. They knew about Messiah, so it was a familiar thing to the Jews during Jesus' time. It's just I think a lot of times in the Old Testament, God uses the events in the Old Testament and examines them in the Old Testament as a symbolic representation of the Messiah. So I want to go through these things and kind of see what symbolism can we find in the Old Testament that shows us that God promised this Messiah. Now, the first one is not very obvious, that we can find that in Genesis 3:15, and it's not obvious. It doesn't even mention Messiah there. But here it is, Genesis 3:15, and I will put enmity between you and the woman. And he's talking to Satan here, or the serpent, who deceived, and I'm going to say it, deceived both of them, the man and the woman. So the human being was deceived, and because of the deception, of course, they lost their salvation. And so God knew from the beginning that this would happen, and He has had a provision from the beginning how He would save humankind. And so here it talks about that. And I will put enmity between you and the woman. Now, what woman is he talking about? Well, he's talking about the woman who will bring forth the offspring. And between your offspring, that is the serpent's offspring, and hers, and he will crush your head. Okay, so here she's talking about the offspring of the woman, and in other translations it says seed. Okay, so her seed, her offspring, her seed is the one that will crush your head, Satan's head, and you will strike his heel. Okay, so that is the first kind of prophecy about the Messiah. God told from the beginning, and Adam knew from the beginning, that God would bring a Redeemer. I'm sure God told Adam when he kicked them out and told them, hey, I will send a Redeemer. Eventually the Redeemer will come. And so Adam knew it. And so this knowledge about the Redeemer was carried on from generation to generation. However, if we look at the Old Testament, like in Genesis, we see that not very many people were following God. We knew that by the time Noah came around, that everybody on this earth, I mean, every human being on this earth, except Noah and his 3 sons, were corrupt. I mean, absolutely corrupt. So not very many people believed in God before the flood. But it was definitely known that Messiah would come, that this Redeemer would come. And throughout the Old Testament, we can see that. And it started with when they sinned, when Adam sinned. And I'm talking about Adam as in plural, the man and the woman sinned. They made themselves leaves, out of leaves. They made themselves clothes covering with leaves. Okay, because they knew after they sinned, after they rebelled against God, they were naked. So they realized their sinfulness and they covered themselves. They hid themselves. They hid their bad nature, their corrupt nature, and they did it with leaves. And God called them. He said, Adam, which he called both of them. He said, Adam, where are you? And so he realized that they covered themselves with leaves. But that was not what God wanted. He was pointing to the real purpose that God had. He wanted them to be covered with blood. And when he made them clothes with skin, that is, of course, that skin came from animals. And because of that animal giving the skin, an animal had to be killed and the blood had to be shed. And so that's, again, a symbolism for Messiah coming and dying for us and atoning us by his blood. So that is very symbolic throughout the Old Testament, that a blood offering had to be brought for the sins. And I also now thinking about Cain and Abel. Of course, Cain and Abel, they were also told that they had to bring a blood offering to the Lord. And of course, Cain, he didn't like that because he was a farmer, and so he didn't think it was right. So he offered to God fruits from his garden. And of course, God said, no, that's not what I want. I want a blood sacrifice for, the sin. And so God didn't look at Cain's offering because of that reason, because God told them, specifically, this is the way I want it. And of course, human beings always have a tendency to do what they want. And so he killed Abel because he thought, well, God looks upon him more favorably. But it was just because this offering was symbolic for the Messiah coming and dying, being the Redeemer that God promised. So that is another example in the Old Testament of how God showed them from the beginning that there is going to be a blood sacrifice necessary of a totally unblemished lamb. And so that the people from the beginning knew that. The same thing happened again then when we go into after the flood. God showed it again to Abraham that a blood sacrifice is necessary. Matter of fact, he even wanted Abraham to use his own son, okay, which is even more symbolic, for God giving his own son as a sacrifice. However, I think Abraham didn't understand it very well, because God showed him then right away, hey, I don't want your son. Okay, this is symbolic. I'm trying to give you a symbolism, for what I'm going to do. I'm going to send my own son to this earth and as a blood sacrifice for the sins of the world. Here, and then he gave him again a lamb to symbolize as a substitute and say, hey, here I have a lamb, sacrifice this instead of Isaac. And I think that is another time when God showed clearly that the sins had to be atoned by a blood sacrifice. And so a little bit about Abraham. The time after Noah, Noah had 3 sons, as most of us know. And one of the sons was Shem, and Shem was the priest, okay, in the family. So he was kind of a high priest. And so Shem continued in his lineage. He kind of moved on this office of priest in his lineage. And so Abraham came out of the lineage of Shem. And however, during the time, I think that was, I don't know, maybe 10 generations after Shem, or maybe less than that. I know it was quite a lot, 5, 6, 7 generations after Shem. Abraham was born, and his father, by that time, his father was already an idol worshiper. And obviously, his father did not listen to Shem and Shem's sons, and so he became an idol worshiper in the government of Nimrod. He was a very high official in the government of Nimrod, and so he left his family. However, what Abraham's father did is he sent his son back to Shem, and so Abraham studied with Shem, and he learned from Shem and his sons that about God. And so this is how he learned about God. And so we know this because later on, Abraham meets Shem. And in the Bible, we hear that he meets Melchizedek. But when we read Jasher, the book of Jasher 16:11 through 12, we learn that this Melchizedek that Abraham meets after one of his battles, and he gives him a 10%, okay, of the spoil of the war. And so that was the high priest, or the priest Melchizedek. And in Jasher we learn that was actually Shem. Okay, now Shem, or Melchizedek, was a high priest, as I said, but he also was the king of Salem. Now Salem is a city that Shem established, and Shem was at the same spot where later on David built the city of Jerusalem. So those two spots are the same. Salem and Jerusalem are the same. And so he was king of Salem, he's king of Jerusalem, and high priest at the same time. Now, when we read Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews understands that very, very well. He says that the Messiah or Jesus is in the order of Melchizedek. So he's in the order of Shem, the high priest, and the king of Salem or Jerusalem. So that's another symbolic representation of Messiah. Okay, is Melchizedek. That actually in Hebrews it says that this Melchizedek did not have a father or a mother. Okay, now we know Shem, of course, had a father and mother, which was Noah and his wife. Okay, but this Melchizedek, this symbolic representation of Messiah doesn't have a father nor a mother. So in other words, Messiah is eternal. Okay, he has no father or mother. Now we know that Jesus had a mother. Okay, however, the Word is eternal, and the Word did not have a father or mother. Okay, so because he was God, and that's something very hard, I know, to understand. I have addressed that a little bit. That Jesus Christ is God in the flesh. That means because he's God, he doesn't have a father and mother. So, and that's very important to understand. And I know something to pray about, and the Holy Spirit really opening your eyes. So I may talk about it a little bit more. And I started already a little bit to talk about the Trinity, and that I don't necessarily believe the definition of the Trinity of the Catholic Church, because it's a little bit confusing. Again, I mean, how confusing can that be? If we think in three persons, like the Son, the Father, and the Holy Spirit, and we're thinking it in human terms, and it just does not fit in the concept of God. So I have a hard time. It is something you just have to let the Holy Spirit show you, and then sometimes you cannot put it in words, I believe. So anyway, so that is that Melchizedek. If you want to read about him in Hebrews, because that is a very nice place to read about the Messiah, is in Hebrews. I'm going to put it in. I can, because I have my thing here. I keep the deck and Hebrews. So let's see if I can get that. It says Hebrews 7. Hebrews 7 talks about Melchizedek the priest. Okay, we know that Jesus is the high priest, and the Jews believe that this Melchizedek, or that Mashiach or Messiah, is the one that will, when he comes, he will combine the two offices of king and priest. Now, something I need to add about this is that during the Mosaic covenant, those two offices were split. Of course, we had the priesthood with the Levites, and the kingship came through Judah. Okay, so we know that these two offices were actually split. However, Messiah will combine the two offices, and that is believed by the Jews today. Okay, they believe that the Mashiach will combine the kingship and the priesthood, and that is also prophesied in Zechariah. Where was that again? Where the branch, we're talking about the branch, and that the branch will build the temple, and that he will combine both. Let me see, I need to find it, if I can find it. Zechariah. Let's see. I don't see it right now. Oh, here it is. Chapter 6. Zechariah, chapter 6, verse 12. Tell him this is what the Lord Almighty says. Here is a man whose name is Branch, and he will branch out from his place and build the temple of the Lord. It is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he will be clothed with majesty and will sit and rule on his throne, and he will be a priest on his throne. Okay? And there will be harmony between the two. So this is where it said that in the Old Testament, in Zechariah, that this person will combine both, just like in the order of Melchizedek. And that is, again, in Hebrew, we can find that. The author of the Hebrew, which some people believe it was Priscilla, which I think is exciting. She, if it was Priscilla, realized, which I think too, because if it would have been written by Paul, Paul would have had his name on the paper, and we would have known it is from Paul. So traditionally, they think it's from Paul, but I don't believe so, because it does not have the same stamp on it as the other letters. So I believe it is from Priscilla, because there is no author. Nobody's taken authorship. And that usually is the case when a woman writes something, in those days. Nobody wants to know that it was written by a woman, because people would just would have rejected it. So I will finish up for today, because I think this is a good place to stop with Melchizedek. Again, do your own research. Read Jasher. Read the book of Jasher, because the book of Jasher just gives you a little more information. And if you're not familiar with the book of Jasher, it is a book that was used during Jesus's time. The sect of the Essenes used it. We found it, I believe it was in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it was a book that was read by the Jews. It was a supplementary historical book of the Old Testament, or of the Genesis account. And so if you don't have one, get yourself a book of Jasher, because I love to read book of Jasher. And so do I. I like the book of Jubilee as well. And both of those give you a better account, or maybe an expanded version of Genesis. Genesis is so limited. Okay, we don't have very much information in Genesis. It's a very compacted, a small account of what really happened before Moses' time. Okay, it's very short, in just one book, So we don't know very much. But so when we read Jasher and Jubilee, then we get a better understanding of what really happened during that time. and I really like that. So anyways, and I'm not, there it comes again, this thing about inspiration, is the book of Chasher and the book of Jubilee inspired. I really believe that they're very close to Genesis. And because they're very close to Genesis, they parallel Genesis very, very similarly, that, yeah, I think they're very good source, very accurate source of what happened. And I wouldn't put them away for nothing. Okay, I mean, we have to read it with the Holy Spirit in mind. Okay, we can't read it without the Holy Spirit. And then when we have the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit will show us things that are important. So I'm going to finish up, and then next time I'm going to continue to show more things from the Old Testament that show us who this Mashiach or Messiah is. So, alrighty. So do your own studies. Read Jasher, the book of Jasher. Read Hebrews, and leave some comments on the bottom. And I will see you soon.